Hello, everybody. This is Brian David Johnson, the guest editor of the IEEE Computer Magazine, the special issue on the world of making. And in this issue, we have been looking at a lot of different types of making, and especially in these podcasts as well. We've been talking with people who are doing work in biology, in design, in science, in business, folks who are investigating technology, who are doing work in entertainment and education. And also we've spent some time talking to people about culture and what are the cultural effects of making. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. And while I'm really excited to have Dr. Melissa Gregg on the podcast. So welcome, Melissa.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here.
So, Melissa, your approach to making is a bit different. How you've come into the world of making and also your background is quite varied and quite different compared to a lot of the other contributors in the magazine. So for our audience members, can you tell us a little bit about your background and also how you came to start looking at the world of making?
Of course, yes. So my background is I have a PhD in gender studies from an Australian university. You can probably tell I have a bit of an accent. Unless you're listening in Australia, of course. But I joined Intel last year as part of a university collaboration exercise. We were running a research center looking at social computing. And one of the things that was most interesting to a lot of the students and faculty that we were working with in this research center were a range of making practices. Now, I didn't really know anything about the maker movement before I took this new job and before I moved to the US and before I started working for a Silicon Valley tech company. So for me, the introduction to making was also part of my introduction to the US and to working for a company as opposed to a university. What I learned by running this research center and talking with the students, postdocs, and faculty that were studying makers and new kinds of making, fixing, and I suppose sustainable practices of repair was that there were different cultural meanings to the idea of making, and that's what I wanted to draw out in my article, to look at the different ways that making matters when you're in a different nation or community setting, and how the practice of making relates to longer histories of cultural innovation that sometimes get lost in some of the hype about making when it's a brand.
And so what do you think it has such resonance? I mean, I would argue, actually, I know you say that your introduction to makers and making was when you came to the United States, but actually, you know, the entire continent of Australia is a group of tinkerers and a group of makers. That deep embedded inside that culture is the notion of tinkering and making and fixing, and as you say, the cultural legacy. So what is it, though, about making and the culture of making that has gotten people so fascinated?
I think the main thing that appeals to an Australian, as you point out, or any person with an innovative or creative streak, is that making puts you in touch with tools that allow you to express yourself. And whether that's in a tradition that's inherited through culture or through religion, or whether that's a tradition of craftsmanship that takes place in a work setting or in an artisanal setting, I think that making is a very powerful way that we understand what we are here to do in the world, and that it allows us a form of self-expression that might not be available through other realms in our lives. And making through technology is also part of the powerful vision of, I think, what people get out of the freedom of internet technology as much as the technologies of communication that we use to build communities. And so that's really the social aspect to making that I think is something I like to emphasize too.
Well, and I agree, Melissa. I mean, I think the work that you've been doing and the work that the Center have been doing points out that making certainly isn't just a brand, and making isn't just a subgenre or subculture, that making is also about culture, and that when people are making, that there's deeper cultural things going on than just participating with a group or participating in a brand. But why do you think it's happening now? That's one of the things I think is really fascinating as I looked at 2014. And I wanted to ask you, do you think it might be happening now because, as you said, there is so much digital making going on, that the idea of physically making, and also both digitally and physically making, are giving something to people that they feel like they're lacking?
It seems like there's an interesting dynamic going on between people's reliance on technology to feel connected, and also a slight paranoia that being too connected through technology is taking us away from the physical in some way. And what happens, it seems to me, in makerspaces and some of these tinkering workshops, or the DIY subcultures that are emerging around making and maker fairs, is that people get together face to face and they show each other how to do things, and they enjoy learning from each other in a way that's very present and presentist. You need to show up. And I think that tradition of passing down knowledge, of sharing skills, which is something quite, I think, universal across cultures, is taking on a new shape in this maker movement. And at the same time, it seems to me like the desire for innovative practices, innovation coming out of austerity, something I mentioned in my article, is a particular historical moment too. So I think it's no accident that a number of the examples people cite in maker manifestos, like the tech shop one, is that people who are looking for work, looking for new ways to harness their creativity and entrepreneurial efforts, are finding each other in these spaces and are developing new businesses and are coming up with ways of being confident in skills that they may not have been trained to use professionally before, but are actually skills that are able to translate to a livelihood. So that to me is a historical moment that's unique and interesting.
Yeah, it seems to be this intersection, as you say, between the kind of the digital and the cultural forces of, like you said, of getting together and making, but at an interesting moment in time as we come out of the Great Recession and we move into a time where there is austerity, there is scarcity, but there also is a large undercurrent inside of making that is entrepreneurial. We've certainly on these podcasts and in the magazine had lots of contributions from people who are entrepreneurs or who have become entrepreneurs because of making. So with all of these things coming together at this moment in time, where do you think this leads us? What is this pointing towards as you look out to the future?
So just drawing on what we were saying, I mean, I think for me what's exciting about what making tells us is that we may be looking at a new future for how we make a living. I think that the ways that people are able to experiment with different skills, the ways that they can experiment with being a business owner or being a hobbyist who might then take an interest in a direction in a more accelerated or determined way than they had considered before, will do a number of things cumulatively. One is that people may start to enjoy their leisure time more. It may take more time to enjoy these sorts of extracurricular or hobbyist pursuits towards ends that may be profitable or may just be pleasurable. But at the same time, I think we're starting to see a move towards the consumer in terms of what kinds of tools they want to be able to access, and also what kinds of hardware access tech companies might need to be providing for consumers in order for them to engage in this kind of activity, this kind of pleasurable, productive activity that it itself may lead to businesses, but also it could just be a way that we enjoy getting in touch with these devices that have been so prominent in our lives over the last few years.
Yeah, I think the perspective that you and the center bring, Think to Making, makes it so much more rich, and so makes it so much more, as you say, than a brand or just a subculture, that it really, I think, places it in the richness of kind of the humanity and what is going on in the world today. So I think it's your article, and I think the work that you've been doing is really quite fascinating. So if our listeners want to read more or see more about the work that you're doing or about work that's being done at the center, where could they find it?
They can definitely get in touch with me direct at Intel. I've got a Twitter account at Gregg, and the center, the ISTC for Social Computing, has its own website too, hosted at the University of California, Irvine. So lots of ways to get in touch. Excellent.
Well, Dr. Melissa Gregg, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for all the work that you did on the article. I think it was a really important addition to the collection and giving us a really well-rounded vision for making in the year 2014. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, and thanks to all the ISTC students who helped out with doing the research on the ground.